Hi everyone, my name is John Hughes and I'm the music director of the Chicago Master Singers. Welcome to the very first session of CMS University. We're really glad you're here. The Chicago Master Singers are a group of about 100 audition singers drawn from across the Chicagoland area that come together to produce the very highest level of choral excellence. And given the present circumstances, that's not possible right now, given the pandemic. So out of this disappointment of not being able to sing and rehearse together, this new idea came, CMS University. Our goal is to provide meaningful musical activities each Monday night, which is our typical rehearsal evening. And we wanted to not only provide this for our CMS members, but for anyone who's interested in learning more about choral music. So whether you're a longtime member of CMS, someone in the local area who might have heard about this from a friend, or joining us from across the country or even world, given the wonders of the internet, we're glad you're here. Welcome. One quick thing, this is really amazing because of technology, right? We can all be together safely at home. And it's different than watching a recorded video. I am doing this live in my basement right now as you're watching it. So you can notice on the right-hand side of your screen the chat window, and you can interact with each other during this. You can ask questions, comment, and it's kind of like being able to pass notes during class, but it's totally okay. If you want to ask me a question, I will from time to time stop and look at the chat. But I already hear that there's a lot of chat going on. So if you want to grab my attention, please start your question with 4 question marks so that it quickly grabs my eye. That would be really helpful. And again, I won't be able to check all of these kind of in real time, but I will stop throughout the session to glance over and answer any questions you might have. So without further ado, let's get started. Our topic for tonight is the scandal and intrigue surrounding Mozart's Requiem. A lot of us probably are familiar with this piece. We may have sung it before or sung or heard other Requiem settings, but we might not be aware that there's a lot of interesting history that goes along with this piece because Mozart died before he completed it. So that's our topic for tonight. Let's get into it. First, just a quick little comment about what a requiem is. We might have heard this term, but we might not really know that it's a whole worship service that was developed over a lot of time. So let's quickly review that. First of all, a requiem is kind of a mass for the dead. This is a very ancient mass setting, actually. It goes back, some of the texts actually existed before the birth of Christ. They're actually Jewish traditional texts. But we see starting in about the 2nd century, and even in parts of the Apocrypha, mentions of the Requiem and those texts that eventually formed the liturgy. Now the liturgy, that means like the actual worship service and its order kind of developed around the 8th or 9th century. And it was really codified by the Council of Trent, which happened in the mid-16th century. And that's when we see the Dies Irae sequence, which is a number of kind of musical movements at least, but a number of parts of the piece are called the Dies Irae sequence. Those are all formed and then put into the Roman Missal by the Council of Trent. So it takes a long time for this mass to actually develop, but its roots are very ancient. Since the year 998, the Requiem has actually been celebrated on All Souls Day, which is November 2nd. So just as a reminder, we have on Halloween, All Hallows Eve is October 31st. On November 1st, we have All Saints Day. That's when we commemorate those saints who have been beatified by the church in an official capacity. And then All Souls Day on November 2nd is when we remember all the faithfully departed. So the Requiem is typically performed in a church setting on November 2nd, as well as at burials and certain amount of days after a burial. Now, just interestingly, there's a tradition in Vienna where Mozart lived at the end of his life to perform his Requiem setting on November 1st, All Saints' Day. And this is what CMS would have done. Our concerts, our performances of this piece this fall would have been October 30th and November 1st. So we were trying to nod to that tradition ourselves. So here's a picture of Mozart at the end of his life, and maybe a little bit different than we're used to seeing him in the red jacket, but this is maybe a little bit more of what he looked like in 1791 when he started this piece. Now Mozart's Requiem is very interesting because it's kind of two sides of the same coin. On one hand, it's very dark and solemn, and that's appropriate for a Requiem setting, that it would be serious and somber. One of the main ways that Mozart achieves that is through the instrumentation. So his inclusion of darker instruments like trombones especially add kind of a mournful quality to the piece. Brass timpani, as well as reed instruments like bassoons, and also the exclusion of brighter woodwind instruments like the clarinet or the flute. Now, Mozart loved clarinets. Everyone who knows Mozart knows that. So he does include the basset horns, which are a member of the clarinet family. They're kind of a little bit longer, and they have a curved bell at the bottom, kind of like a saxophone in a way. And he does include those. They are similar to a clarinet, but have maybe a little bit of a darker tone quality. Again, this really portrays this kind of solemnity and mystery of death. But on the other hand, Mozart's Requiem is very soothing and warm and reassuring. And so I think he really captures both kind of the pain and seriousness of death, as well as reassuring those left behind. And I think that's one of the reasons that even now, centuries after it was written, this work is still so meaningful to us today. Now, one thing that we're going to talk a lot about today is Mozart's genius. And at some time, you might think that I might even be questioning his genius, saying that Mozart had help with this. That's not at all the case. Mozart is clearly a genius and someone who very much is one of the greatest musical minds ever to live. But he didn't live in a vacuum. He was influenced by the time period and the place where he lived, like all of us. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the influences that are evident in Mozart's Requiem. And again, this isn't dispelling this idea that Mozart was an unparalleled genius. He certainly was. But he also was a product of where he lived. So one of the clearest influences on the Mozart Requiem is actually the Requiem of Michael Haydn, who you see here. He's the younger brother of the maybe more famous Joseph Haydn, and he wrote a Requiem setting for the Archbishop in 1771, so a full 20 years before Mozart's in 1791. And this is very clear that Mozart was modeling his Requiem on Michael Haydn's. And this isn't the scholar here, Richard Maunder, who we're going to talk about at the end of the presentation tonight. He calls it almost a parody. And this isn't anything immoral that Mozart he wasn't stealing from Michael Haydn. Rather, you've got to really think about it almost like a scholarly musical conversation. We know that Mozart was an ardent fan of music history. And one of the big patrons at the time, Baron von Swieten, had a large musical manuscript collection that we know Mozart went to and studied the scores of Bach and Handel, and very much learned from the masters that preceded him. And this is significant because, this was before the internet and when you could Google anything. So these manuscripts were really worth their weight in gold, and we know that Mozart availed himself of that. So let's look at an example here from the Michael Haydn Requiem. This is the Cum Sanctis Tuis section from Michael Haydn's Requiem. This is in the communion movement at the very end. And it goes like this. I'll play it for you here. I have a keyboard set up. So a very kind of distinctive melody, kind of still antico style, where we have the half note getting the beat. It's in two. And I think one of the things that makes this the most distinctive is this descending diminished seventh from the A flat on 2Es on the A flat to the B natural. So again, the whole thing goes like this. So a very kind of memorable melody. Now let's look at what Mozart writes for that same text in the Communion movement. Okay, it's in a different key. Here's my score that's all marked and prepared. And it goes like this. It's in a different key, but listen. You hear that? So that B flat to C sharp, diminished seventh, descending, right? So it's almost like he clearly was modeling this, right? He sets the same text with a very similar idea. Now, one scholar who I admire very much, Chet Alwis, says, this idea or this musical motif actually appears throughout a lot of music of this time period. He kind of refers to it. It may have been simply a common stock theme at the time, because we see it in other examples here. Let me show you. So in the Mozart Solemn Vespers, which we were also going to perform, we see a very similar idea on the Laudate Pueri. Right, so again, that B flat to C sharp. And we even see it in Messiah on And With His Stripes We Are Healed. So again, the point isn't to accuse Mozart of lifting musical ideas from other composers. It's more to show that he's not composing in a vacuum. He was drawing upon other compositions at the same time. There are other borrowings throughout Mozart's Requiem. This Tedeci hymnus in the soprano actually is a quote of a Gregorian chant, and Michael Haydn uses the same Gregorian chant for the same line. So again, he's really having a conversation with other composers of the Requiem genre. I also want to point out the very famous Tuba Mirum, the trombone solo, which starts the movement. It sounds like this. Right? Very distinctive thing. There's not going to be a drop the needle quiz, but if there were, that would be maybe a section I might play, because it's so distinctive. You hear that and you know immediately we're in the Mozart Requiem. But Mozart didn't write that. It had been part of other settings by Fuchs and Reuter. It was just a very common trombone riff, if you will, and Mozart integrates it into his own Requiem setting. There's one other Requiem by Gossman that is pretty clearly influential on Mozart's setting as well. So, a lot of interesting things here. There's also Masonic elements. We know that Masonry was very important to Mozart. His father was a Mason, as was his grandfather. And some of the ideas in his Requiem have been tied to Masonry. Now, I don't think any of us can say, sitting here in 2020, that Mozart did any of this intentionally to kind of integrate Mason ideas into his Requiem. But the coincidences are there, so I feel like I should maybe point them out. First of all, the use of basset horns is very distinctive in Mozart's Requiem here. We see other composers use it, Mendelssohn, for example, but it is a rather unusual instrument. But it was very common in Mason events to have them. They were used kind of for incidental music, for ceremonial music. And again, because they provided kind of this weighty gravitas to the ceremonies. And so did Mozart integrate that into his Requiem on purpose as a nod to Masonry? I'm not sure, but there is that connection there. Another connection is the Ostias movement is in E flat major, which is kind of far flung from D minor, which the Requiem is really set on, right? So, related keys from D minor might be F major or A major, but he really kind of goes out of his way to go to E flat major. And this is significant because Masons really viewed this as the wisdom key, right? So it was a very special tonal center for them. Now, one other thing is the similarities between the Requiem and Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute. Mozart wrote this at the same time as his Requiem, and it's been very well documented, these kind of other coincidences between the magic flute and Masonry. And so one scholar I read said, well, the beginning of the Dies Irae section really sounds similar to the beginning of the Queen of the Night aria. Or the bass soloist really sounds like the bass character in magic flute. I'm not sure about all that, but it is significant. And really, Masonry was a very special part of Mozart's identity. So it is worth mentioning. On the screen here, I put a painting of a Viennese Masonic lodge. At the time that Mozart lived, at one point people thought that this lodge was even Mozart's lodge, or that he might even be in this painting. But another scholar I read said, I'm not too sure about that. Maybe this is a good time to stop and look at the chat. Just as a reminder, if you're tuning in a little late, if you want, I see lots of people saying hello to each other and checking in from all of where they're watching from. That's great. If you want my attention, please feel free to put 4 question marks in front of your question so that I'm able to kind of grab them right away. It does look like a dissertation topic would be the basset horns in Mozart, not the basset hounds. All right, let's talk a little bit about how the Requiem fits into Mozart's life and what happened after he died. So 1791, this is when it all starts and ends in a way for Mozart. In May of that year, he took a position, an unpaid position, as kind of the assistant Kapellmeister at St. Stephen's Cathedral here in Vienna. A Kapellmeister is the director of music position. And for a long time before this, he really hadn't written much sacred music. In fact, he had written very little, if any, over the previous decade. But in 1791, he maybe becomes more interested in that. This is when he writes the Requiem. It's also when he writes the Ave Verum Corpus, which is really kind of the gem that distills Mozart's choral style in 40 measures. So 1791, he's in Vienna. He's working at St. Stephen's. And on one day in June or July, we don't know the specific date, someone dressed all in gray, rather mysteriously, knocks on his door and gives Mozart a sack full of gold coins and asks that he write a Requiem setting. And at times, after this all transpires, this person is viewed as a bad omen, right? Someone kind of randomly showing up at his door, asking him to write a piece about death, and then Mozart would die December 5th of that year. Well, it turns out that this supposed gray-clad messenger was really an agent of this gentleman here on your screen, Count Waltzig Stupach. And he was a wealthy patron of the arts at the time, and he, I think, was rather odd. I think he was very zealous and liked commissioning music, and at times people can kind of accused him of writing out the commissions in his own handwriting and passing it out like he wrote it. One other scholar I read said, well, he might have done that, but he could have been copying them into his own handwriting and then having people play and having a performance and then kind of asking guests and audience members to try and guess who wrote this piece. So kind of a little parlor game or a party game. So, at one point, Waltzig Stupach kind of got romanticized into a villain. I don't think that's really the case. I think he was just a very kind of ardent lover of music. We also know that his wife, at a very young age, died on February 14th of 1791. So this Requiem was commissioned in her honor, and I think that's maybe a truer understanding of his intent. Now, at the time, Mozart was balancing a lot of things. He, like many musicians, he had many irons in the fire. So he got this commission for the Requiem. He was also writing Magic Flute. He was writing La Clemenza di Tito, which is one of his other operas, completed in 18 days, and also the Little Masonic Cantata, right? So he's writing a ton of different pieces simultaneously. And that might be where we get some of the crossover happening between Magic Flute and the Requiem. So he gets this commission. He starts almost immediately in June or July of that year. He takes a little bit of a break when he goes to Prague for the premiere of Tito, and then he resumes when he returns to Vienna. We know that on December 4th, he kind of supervises a read-through in his home from his deathbed, and then he dies the next day on December 5th. So when he dies, there's this huge problem because he didn't finish the work. And this problem presents a major question, which is who wrote what? The only movement that Mozart completely finished, meaning every note, is the Requiem Aeternam, the very first movement. For all the movements from then through the Ostias, he only wrote the choral parts, the bass line, the cello and bass line, which of course had the figures, the harmonic figures for what chords to use, and he used some instrumentation. He indicated some instrumentation. Now for the Lacrimosa movement within that section, he only wrote 8 measures of the choral part. That leaves 4 movements, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, the Benedictus, and the Communion, where he didn't write anything. There's nothing there. So he really kind of left a blueprint. The studs and all the framing of the house was done, but someone needed to come in and, lay down the floors and put up the drywall and decorate it. So who wrote what? What happens after Mozart dies? Here we have his widow, Constanza, who was left kind of holding the bag, right? She wanted to finish this piece because, when he got the commission, he only got paid half of the fee. So she wanted to finish the work to collect the rest of the money. And she had a number of young children to support, right? So this was a huge issue going on in and how to finish this work quickly, right? So she goes to Mozart's students and says, can you help me, right? So she goes to this first one, Freistritler, and he adds some parts to the Kyrie fugue, and after only a few days, if at all, he returns it. He doesn't spend much time on it. He gives up very quickly. Now, 11 days later, she goes to Abler, a second student, and he does a pretty good job. He drafts some orchestrations and adds 2 more measures to the soprano part of Lacrimosa, and then he too quits. He just can't do it. Finally, she goes to Franz Xaver Süssmayr, who completes the work that we know it the best. Now, it's kind of interesting that she waits to go to Süssmayr because, in a way, he was the pupil that was closest to Mozart at the time. And in the 30 years after this all happened, in the 1820s, Constanza was asked, why didn't you just go to Süssmayr right away? And she replied that she couldn't remember, but she kind of has a vague memory that she had a grudge. They had some falling out, and she was bearing a grudge, and so she delayed asking Süssmayr to complete it. Well, who knows if that's really true, right? Constanza could have been doing this for a number of reasons. One theory that I've read is that she and Süssmayr may have had an affair, and that Süssmayr may have even fathered one of her children. And so she was upset with him and didn't want him to be in charge of her husband's legacy after he died. But whatever her motivation is, Süssmayr is the one who finished it. And we're really grateful to him because without him, we wouldn't have this work today. Let's talk a little bit about him. So he was 25 years old at the time. Here he is pictured. He completed the work about mid-1792, and he finished orchestrating the movements that Mozart and the other students had tried to do. And then he completely produced on his own the Sanctus, the Benedictus, the Agnus Dei, and the Communion movements. None of this material that we know of exists in Mozart's own handwriting, so it's presumed that Süssmayr invented it on his own. Now, almost immediately, Süssmayr's completion becomes under challenge, right? And there's a couple of reasons. First of all, Mozart's sister-in-law here accuses Süssmayr of talking to Mozart at that read-through the day before Mozart died and exchanging information about how to complete the works, the movements that Mozart didn't get to yet. And that Süssmayr didn't kind of own up to the fact that Mozart had kind of given him some advice on how to complete those works, and rather portrayed those works as being of his own invention. Similarly, Maximilian Stadler here says that he witnessed Süssmayr stealing pieces of paper from Mozart's desk after he died. And, could those have been sketches for these movements that Süssmayr claims he wrote on his own? Now, we're not really sure, this is all kind of he said, she said. And these people were very close with Constanza, who had a very vested interest in kind of getting rid of Süssmayr's responsibility for the Requiem, right? Her goal was to get the money from Walsing Stupach, right? He commissioned Mozart to write a Requiem setting, not Süssmayr. So her real incentive was to kind of say, yeah, Süssmayr maybe dotted some I's and crossed some T's, but this is the Requiem by Mozart, my husband, who you commissioned. Here it is, please give me the money, right? So it's a little bit hard to know who to trust in this moment. So, like I said, he's almost immediately under attack, right? Again, one of Constanza's friends wrote in 1798 this book saying that Süssmayr really didn't do much, right? And this is called the Requiem Streit, so the fight over the Requiem. Likewise, here in 1800, we have the first edition of the Mozart Requiem. Here's a picture of the cover, published in Leipzig, and no mention of Süssmayr, even though we believe he wrote the final 4 movements. So it kind of immediately gets under attack. Now, one of the reasons that that Süssmayr becomes under attack is there are admittedly some maybe clunky moments in the orchestration that Mozart probably wouldn't have made these mistakes. So for those, Süssmayr gets blamed. He can't win. He gets blamed for the sections of the Requiem that maybe could be improved. And for the Requiem, the parts of the Requiem that work very well that we know Mozart didn't write, people say, well, there's no way Süssmayr wrote that. He probably had insider knowledge. So it's really, he can't win. He gets blamed for the difficult sections, and he gets kind of accused of not being able to write the sections that are more successful. So either way, Süssmayr cannot win. Even a century later, Johannes Brahms says, Süssmayr carefully copied Mozart's draft and completed it with as much industry as piety. So he's kind of saying, yeah, this is Mozart's genius, and Süssmayr maybe did the best he could to flesh it out. But Brahms seems to maybe discount what Süssmayr really did to complete this work. And I'll give you my opinion on that in a little bit. One thing that's interesting to note here is that even though Süssmayr gets a lot of criticism for the orchestration of the Requiem, that is actually the very thing that early critics of the Requiem praised. So here in late 1804, there's a performance here, and a review appears in January of 1805 that praises the instrumentation, saying that the basset horns and bassoons were so effective that the heavenly melodies from the perspective and expression and even sound seemed to come from one instrument. So again, I think some of Süssmayr's reputation is tarnished in kind of political maneuvering here to protect Mozart's legacy and to protect Constanza. Now, as we become further removed from Mozart in the 20th century, we've taken maybe a little bit more of a nuanced approach, right? So we know that Waldseck Stupach was not the villain that some of the 19th century biographers portrayed him to be. And also we've come to understand more about Mozart at the time of his death, right? There's kind of this, thanks to the movie Amadeus, right, this kind of romanticized version of him kind of writing feverishly and in financial trouble and dying alone. I think there might be a grain of truth in some of that, but I think that's maybe a little overblown, right? So we know that Mozart did have a very small funeral, right? And very few people in attendance. But we have learned that that was the custom in Vienna at the time. They thought that once someone died, that their body was not worth anything anymore, right? Their soul was gone. So they often really prioritized a very quick burial with just close family and friends. This was not a moment to have an elaborate funeral service. We do know that Baron von Sweden did do a benefit performance to help Mozart's widow Constanza, and over 1,000 people came to that, right? So Mozart certainly did not die in oblivion, and I think like many musicians, his finances were scattered at times, but I don't think he was destitute in the way that we might like to think of him. Now, one really interesting thing is that in 1963, not too long ago, Wolfgang Platt discovered a sketch here in Mozart's handwriting of an Amen fugue that was supposed to end the Lacrimosa. And for whatever reason, Süssmayr did not follow this plan. Right? Here's Mozart saying, all right, at the end of the whole Dies Irae sequence, do the Lacrimosa and then do this Amen fugue. And Süssmayr didn't do it. We're not really sure why. And so later, scholars have reconstructed this piece and added it. And we're going to talk about that here. So in the 1970s, this idea of authenticity sweeps across the field of music, right? We become very interested in performance practice. You know, how fast would Bach have played this on the organ? What does A equal? Does it equal 440, or is it 430, or is it even higher, 445, right? People are really trying to get back to how would a composer who lived a long time ago want this to be played? How did he or she imagine it, right? And so people then start to say, well, Süssmayr, you know, who is he to complete the Mozart Requiem? Maybe I know more now than Süssmayr, and I'm going to do a better job, right? So we start to see modern completions of the work come about. So in 1972, we see Franz Bayard, who did a very kind of low-impact job, just kind of touched it up. And it really progressed until Levin's 1991 completion, which is very full, very radical, and also the most successful one. And so we're going to actually listen here to the Lacrimosa and Amen fugue. So remember, Mozart only wrote 8 measures of the Lacrimosa, and just for the chorus, and nothing else. So Levin takes those 8 measures and expands them, right? So this is going to sound different than the Süssmayr that many of us are most familiar with. And then at the end of the Lacrimosa, instead of the very kind of understated, simple cadence that Süssmayr does on the word Amen, it goes straight into this fugue that was discovered, the main idea was discovered in 1963. So let me get YouTube set up here, and then we'll listen to the Levin introduction here. I love watching you all in the chat. It is wild. It's crazy. And it's very exciting, I think. And I think it does merit, the 11 completion does merit performance, right? It is a very different piece in a way, but it's very exciting. So sometimes you will see, concerts advertise Mozart Requiem 11 completion, and then now you know what that means. So I've been checking the chat. I think it all looks good. I don't know if there's a cyber base available for the 11. I can definitely check on that. So let's talk a little bit about how, knowing all that we know about this, how we might view the Mozart Requiem today. Forgive the long quote, but I think it's worth it here. This is by the British musicologist Simon Keefe. He says, "The original participants in the unfolding Requiem drama in 1791-92 could have been forgiven for considering themselves victims in an Albrecht-style curse of the work. Mozart died writing it. Constanza was beset by endless financial and artistic wrangling over the manuscript, warily leaving the later Requiem strite, the fight over the Requiem, to others. Frestrettler, the first student who tried to complete this work, sank more or less without a trace, eking out in existence until dying destitute in 1841 after a maximum of 5 days trying to orchestrate the Kyrie fugue, assuming he worked on it at all. Zussmayer, the one who completed it as we best know it, lived to see his work airbrushed out, unattributed, doubted, and discounted. And even Abler, that's the second student who tried to finish the work, who held the curse at bay for a long time, duly succumbed to a stroke while conducting, you guessed it, the Mozart Requiem in 1833. So it does seem like what is going on with this piece, that everyone who ever touched it or was near it died in some kind of weird way. Now, maybe this is the stuff that makes Hollywood movies interesting, but it's also maybe just what life was like then, as a musician. It's always been a hard way to make a living. Life was hard. People could die very easily. And so it is kind of the stuff that makes your imagination go wild, but I don't know if it's really a curse, so to speak. Now, Mozart and Zussmayer, for better or for worse, are inextricably linked. Their legacies are forever one and the same in regards to this piece, at least. Now, Mozart, he had kind of a sharp tongue and a colorful vocabulary. And so I'm going to just share with you a few of the names that he called Zussmayer. An idiotic fellow, Sauermeier, so a play on the word sour in German, and many more colorful names that I don't want to put up on a public YouTube video, but they're pretty crass. So Mozart, that was kind of his sense of humor. But for better or for worse, I think, in my opinion, should be very grateful to Zussmayer, because without him, we would not have this work. Now, Zussmayer certainly had Mozart's advice in his ears, right? Mozart is the artistic vision for this piece. But we should also recognize that Zussmayer is the executor of that vision, right? He made countless decisions, large and small, in order to complete this work. It was much more than dotting the I's and crossing the T's, or what Brahms said about as much industry as piety. He really did a lot. It's not an insignificant amount. And I think to recognize this doesn't really diminish Mozart's genius. Mozart is clearly a genius. But without Zussmayer, we wouldn't have this Requiem, which I think is one of the greatest pieces in the choral orchestral canon that we are all excited to perform, in 2020, so many years later. So I think it's really time to maybe consider that Zussmayer played an important part in this very important piece. Eric Smith, a British musician, says it better than I can. He says, Zussmayer was certainly no Mozart, right? I don't know any other pieces by Zussmayer. I know lots of Mozart pieces. So Zussmayer was clearly no Mozart, but he was a composer in Vienna in 1791 and close to Mozart. Advantages that contemporary musicologists and even people like myself so patently lack, right? So maybe it's time to really consider that Zussmayer might have something interesting to say as well. So I want to end tonight just very briefly talking about this really interesting topic, which is the Mozart Requiem as a mirror. What do I mean by that? This is actually a term by the Japanese musicologist Bin Ibsawa. And he says different ages and different personalities have their own ways of hearing the sound of the past and of listening to them from their own standpoint, right? So when we listen to this, we listen to it as people from 2020, not as someone in 1791. And maybe this is a challenge in a way to this authenticity movement, because as close as we can come to performing it as the way Mozart envisioned it, those of us who hear it don't hear it the way that people in Vienna in 1791 hear it. We hear it as people in 2020 hearing it. And I think composers throughout time, since the beginning of this piece, since this piece came about, have gone to the well of Mozart Requiem for inspiration, not in an attempt to duplicate it, but rather in an attempt to discover themselves. So one example of this here is the two transcriptions of Mozart Requiem by Franz Liszt, the great piano virtuoso and composer. We know that Liszt was an ardent fan of the Mozart Requiem. He, in 1856, conducted a program of all Mozart in honor of the 100th birth year of Mozart, who was born in 1756. And he conducted a significant amount of the Requiem on that concert and then made these two piano transcriptions. And what's interesting to note here, and we're going to listen to his transcription of the Lacrimosa, is that he doesn't just reduce it, taking it from a full orchestral piece, choral orchestral movement, down to the piano. He doesn't do that. Rather, he makes it his own. It's really much more of an arrangement than a transcription. And he adds tremolos and just romanticizes it in a way that Mozart would never have done, but I think is really, really effective and affective at the same time. So let's listen to a performance of Liszt's transcription, or as I would call it, arrangement of Lacrimosa.
Build custom industrial machines in days.
Hi, I'm Brad Callen, and in this video,
Sorry about all the technology. Maybe, we keep the cost down at CMS University, so we haven't sprung for YouTube Premiere or whatever, but maybe we'll consider it after that ad. I'm sorry for the interruption. So you can tell, though, that is Liszt, right? That is not Mozart. But at the same time, it's really acting as a mirror through which I think the Mozart Requiem really helps us understand ourselves as much as understanding Mozart at the same time. So let me talk for a minute about some of the sources I used to produce this. Obviously, I didn't come up with this all on my own, and I just kind of briefly want to walk you through some of these. Chet Alwis taught for many, many years at the University of Illinois, led one of the top doctoral programs, and he has this 2-volume book, A History of Western Choral Music, that is really par none. I mean, it's the best one. So I used that significantly for this. The Bin Absawa article here is where the last few slides came from. Now this Geringer book, the Mozart Companion, that's a chapter in the Mozart Companion, and a few down, the Robbins Landon, the Mozart Compendium. Very important works from the 20th century, maybe a little dated, but definitely kind of the largest scope focusing just on Mozart. So check those out if you're interested. The Translations and Annotations book, that's a 4-volume set that goes through and translates everything, but also really helps you understand different genres. So not only the Requiem genre, but if you're singing a motet like Ubi Caritas, that book will tell you why that text, what that text means and how it would be used liturgically. The Simon Keefe article really solidified a lot of my thinking about Zussmeyer, so you can check that out. The last few, the Novak, that's the preface to the score I'm using for the Mozart Requiem, the Baron writer. Ray Robinson talks about one of the newer completions of the Mozart Requiem, and then this Zuderman article talks about the Gossman Requiem that may have also influenced Mozart. So just a few quick rundown of the bibliography, because I want to be sure to cite my sources here at CMS University. I want to just take one last minute here. I've been looking at the chat during the videos, and I see the few questions that there were for me were answered by other people, so that's great. But I do want to encourage you throughout these sessions to use the chat, ask me questions, because that's what makes us more fun than just watching a pre-recorded video. This is happening live, so avail yourself of that opportunity. Now, one last thing before we sign off for tonight, and that is that at the end of every session of CMSU, I want to end with what I'm calling a moment of Zen. This pandemic has ripped my heart out in a lot of ways. The absence of singing has been really painful for myself, and I'm assuming many of you who are tuning in. And one of the ways that I've coped with this is to listen to recordings of choral music, to remember why I love what I do so much. And it's been a real balm to me, and I wanted to share that with you. So at the end of every session, I'm going to play a short piece, nothing too long, but something kind of a serene nightcap, if you will, to kind of set our minds at ease before we turn in for the night. So tonight's moment of Zen is I Sat Down Under His Shadow by Edward Bairstow, the great English anthem here, a setting of the Song of Solomon. And the text, I think, is particularly beautiful. It says, I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to his banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Let's listen. Thank you very much for joining us for this very first session of CMS University. I'm really glad you were here and could take part. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about the Requiem genre before Mozart and after. So we're going to talk with about the very first known polyphonic Requiem setting from the 1450s by Johannes Ockeghem. And then we're going to survey the later ones after Mozart, the Verdi Requiem, the Berlioz Requiem, the Fauré Requiem, and then we're going to go to ones who took maybe a little bit more liberty, the Brahms Requiem, and we're going to conclude with 2016 Requiem, a secular Requiem actually, by Dale Trumbore. So it's going to be a great session. Make sure you register. The link is in the description below using Eventbrite. And just make sure that you add Eventbrite to your address book so those live stream links don't get added to your spam folder, okay? A few other things. If you're watching this recorded, you're welcome to comment and I'll interact with you that way. So if you have questions, concerns, feedback, leave it in the comment section and we'll get to it. And also, if you're watching this after the fact, make sure to register for one of the live streams so you can join us at the time. I also would like to ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our videos, share our videos, invite your family and friends. There's no cap on the size of CMS University. We're just glad you're here. So please help spread the word. Finally, I do want to ask you to consider making a donation. We've set up a couple different ways to do it. You can do a recurring monthly donation through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. This is just where you subscribe with your credit card and it draws whatever you're able to donate monthly to help sustain CMS. You can also go to our website, chicagomastersingers.org, and make a one-time donation there. Regardless of what you donate, we're really grateful. Obviously, this is a challenging time for all nonprofits, and whatever you can donate, we really appreciate it. So thanks again for coming to CMSU, and I hope to see you next week. Have a good night.